Somewhere in the Aegean Sea in the year 1901, a group of sponge divers pulled a lump of corroded bronze out of a shipwreck that was over 2,000 years old. Nobody thought much of it at first. It looked like scrap. It sat in a museum drawer for years before anyone noticed something strange inside it. Gears. Dozens of them. Hand-cut, precisely calibrated interlocking gears built into a device that predicted eclipses, tracked the moon's irregular orbit, and mapped the positions of planets over 2,000 years before Europe built anything close to it again. This object is called the Antikythera. Mechanism, and more than a century later, with CT scanners and X-ray imaging that the original engineers could never have imagined, we still cannot fully explain who built it or why something this advanced simply vanishes from the historical record for the next 1,500 years. And that is just one piece of a much bigger pattern. Across almost every continent, ancient civilizations left behind objects, structures and writings that modern science, with all its tools, all its data, and all its expertise, still cannot fully explain. Not because we lack curiosity, not because we lack technology, but because the evidence itself resists easy answers. This is not a story about aliens or lost magic. It is a story about how much we still do not know about the people who came before us, and how the smartest researchers on the planet are still working, piece by piece, to catch up with the past. Let's go back to that bronze device from the shipwreck near the island of Antikythera. Researchers now believe it was built around 100 BC, likely somewhere in the Greek world, possibly linked to the island of Rhodes, which was known at the time for its astronomers and engineers. Using modern CT scans, scientists have been able to see inside the corroded bronze fragments without breaking them apart, revealing a complex gear train of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, some with teeth just over a millimeter wide, cut by hand, with a precision that would be difficult even with modern hand tools. The device could track the position of the sun and moon, predict lunar and solar eclipses years in advance, follow the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games, and even model the irregular motion of the moon using a clever gear-within-a-gear system that mimics what we now call the moon's elliptical orbit. This last detail is what stuns historians of science the most, because that same technique, a gear mounted slightly off-center to simulate elliptical motion, does not reappear in European technology until the 14th century, in astronomical clocks built more than 1,000 years later. So the real mystery is not just how the Antikythera mechanism worked. We have mostly figured that out. The mystery is why nothing like it exists before it, and why nothing like it exists again for over a millennium afterward. Was this a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, the work of a single genius engineer who left no successors? Or is it the last surviving example of a much larger tradition of Greek mechanical engineering, an entire field of ancient technology that was lost, destroyed, or simply never written down in a way that survived? We do not have the workshop. We do not have the schematics. We do not have the name of the person who built it. We have one object, fished out of the sea by accident, and the unsettling realization that ancient engineering may have gone far further than the surviving historical texts ever suggested. Now travel from the Aegean Sea to the island of Crete, home of the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest complex societies in Europe, famous for its palaces, its frescoes of bull-leaping ceremonies, and its sudden collapse around 1450 BCE, which is itself still debated among archaeologists. But the deeper mystery from Crete is not the collapse, it is the writing. The Minoans left behind thousands of clay tablets inscribed with a script known as Linear A. We can read the numbers on these tablets, we can recognize some symbols that seem to represent goods, quantities, maybe trade records, but we cannot read the language itself. Linear A remains undeciphered. This is different from its more famous cousin, Linear B, which was cracked in the 1950s and turned out to be an early form of Greek. Linear A is something else entirely, possibly a language unrelated to Greek altogether, with some researchers suggesting connections to Anatolian languages once spoken in what is now Turkey, like Luwian or Lycian, without a bilingual text, something like a Rosetta Stone that shows the same message in Linear A in a language we already understand. We have no reliable way to translate it. Even modern computational and AI-assisted approaches to decipherment have not cracked it. So somewhere in those clay tablets could be trade ledgers, religious texts, poetry, or historical records of a civilization that we can see through its art and architecture, but cannot hear in its own words. It is one of the oldest silences in European history, and it has stayed silent for over 3,500 years. A similar kind of silence surrounds a manuscript that is far more recent in age, but no less mysterious. The Voynich manuscript is a book from the early 15th century, written in an unknown script, in what appears to be an unknown language, filled with illustrations of plants that do not match any known species, strange diagrams of what might be, astronomical charts, and pages that appear to depict human figures bathing in green liquid inside tubes and pipes. It has been studied by professional cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, and codebreakers for over a century, including some of the same people who worked on breaking military codes during the World Wars. Every proposed solution, every claimed decipherment, has eventually collapsed under scrutiny. Statistical analysis of the text shows patterns consistent with a real language rather than random gibberish, which rules out the simplest explanation, that it's an elaborate hoax with no actual content. But nobody has been able to identify what that language is, or convincingly translate a single page in a way that holds up against expert review. It sits in Yale University's Bennica Library today, fully digitized, fully available for study by anyone in the world, and it remains, after everything modern science has thrown at it, completely unread. Now shift continents entirely, to the high desert plains of southern Peru, where between roughly 1 and 700 AD, the Nazca people created massive line drawings by removing the reddish surface stones of the desert to reveal the lighter, colored ground underneath. These are the Nazca lines, and they include geometric shapes, straight lines running for kilometers, and enormous figures of animals like a hummingbird, a monkey, and a spider, so large that they are only fully visible from the air. The Nazca people had no aircraft. They had no way to see their own designs from above while they were creating them. And yet the proportions are precise enough that early theories assumed only astronomy could explain them, treating the lines as some kind of massive celestial calendar. Modern archaeologists have moved away from a single unifying explanation, and current research increasingly suggests a connection to water and rain rituals, given that the region is one of the driest deserts on Earth. In ancient communities, there were deeply dependent on unpredictable water sources. Satellite imaging has also helped resolve a related mystery in the same region, a series of mysterious spiraling holes near the Nazca lines that puzzled researchers for years. That particular puzzle now appears solved. The holes were likely wells, built by the Nazca for accessing groundwater, arranged in a spiral pattern that made maintenance and access easier, evidence of a far more advanced hydraulic engineering system than the Nazca were previously given credit for. But the lines themselves, why this particular figure? Why that particular animal? Why draw something at a scale that only makes sense from a viewpoint the artists themselves could never have had? That puzzle is not fully solved. It's narrowed. It's better understood, but it is not closed. If the Nazca lines feel large, they are dwarfed by something most people have never heard of, found not in Peru, but in the Bolivian highlands. High on the Altiplano, near the Nevado Sajama volcano, lies a network of perfectly straight paths etched into the earth, some of them stretching 20 kilometers in a single line, cutting through mountains and valleys with a level of precision that modern surveyors still find difficult to explain. Without instruments the people who made them should not have had. In total, this network, known as the Sajama lines, covers more than 22,000 square kilometers, making it roughly 15 times larger than the entire Nazca Lines complex. Researchers generally attribute the lines to indigenous groups like the Aymara or the earlier Tiwanaku civilization, with construction beginning as far back as 1000 BC. But the purpose remains genuinely unresolved. Were they pilgrimage routes connecting sacred shrines and burial towers scattered across the landscape? Were they some kind of ritual pathway system tied to astronomical alignment? Or were they simply the accumulated result of centuries of foot traffic between villages, later formalized into a kind of sacred infrastructure? Nobody has definitively answered how a network of this scale, spanning such a punishing and remote landscape, was planned and executed with this much geometric consistency, using nothing more than direct observation and generations of accumulated knowledge passed down without writing. Off the southern coast of Japan's Yonaguni Island, divers in the 1980s discovered something that immediately triggered global debate. A massive underwater rock formation, at least 165 feet long and 65 feet wide, with flat terraces, sharp right angles, and step-like formations that some divers swore looked exactly like a man-made stepped pyramid. It quickly earned the nickname Japan's Atlantis, and the debate around it has never fully settled. One camp of researchers argues that the formation is entirely natural, the product of tectonic uplift and thousands of years of erosion acting on sandstone that naturally fractures along straight lines, a geological process that can produce shapes deceptively similar to deliberate construction. Another camp, including some professional archaeologists and geologists, maintains that certain features, like what appear to be carved steps, drainage channels, and a formation resembling a face, are too regular to be fully explained by natural processes alone, and may represent the remains of a structure built when sea levels were dramatically lower more than 10,000 years ago during the last ice age. If that dating is correct, it would predate all known monumental architecture on Earth by thousands of years, older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, older than Göbekli Tepe. And that is an enormous claim, and it is exactly why mainstream archaeology remains cautious about it. But the Yonaguni monument has never been definitively explained either way. It sits underwater, half accepted, half dismissed, waiting for evidence solid enough to end the argument. Back on land, in a remote part of Zhejiang province in eastern China, farmers discovered a series of enormous underground caverns in 1992 while draining ponds for fish farming. What they found were not natural caves, but the Longyu Caves, an interconnected network of vast, man-made chambers carved directly out of siltstone bedrock, with towering columns, smooth carved walls, and ceilings marked with parallel chisel patterns so consistent they look almost machine-made. There are at least 24 of these chambers discovered so far, some large enough to hold several hundred people, and estimates suggest that removing all that rock would have required moving roughly 1 million cubic meters of stone, an effort that would have taken an enormous, coordinated workforce. And here is the strange part. There are no historical records describing their construction, no inscriptions naming who built them, no dates carved into the walls, no local legends passed down that clearly explain their original purpose. Radiocarbon dating of nearby sediment suggests construction may date back at least 2,000 years, but even that estimate is not fully settled, and the purpose remains genuinely unknown. Theories range from ancient stone quarries to underground palaces to secret military storage sites to ceremonial spaces, but none of these theories has enough direct evidence to be considered proven. An entire underground construction project on this scale, and the people who commissioned it left behind almost no trace of why. In Bolivia, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, sits the ancient site of Pumapunku, part of the broader Tiwanaku civilization that flourished roughly 1,000 years before the rise of the Inca Empire. What makes Pumapunku famous is not its size, but the precision of its stonework. Massive stone blocks, some weighing well over 100 tons, cut with interlocking joints, perfectly straight edges, and repeating geometric patterns so precise that some of the stones appear to have been machined rather than hand-carved. The stone itself, andesite and red sandstone, is exceptionally hard, and the nearest quarries capable of supplying it are located many kilometers away, across difficult terrain, at a time before the wheel was in common use in the Andes, and before draft animals capable of hauling multi-ton loads were part of the local economy. So the standing archaeological questions are not really about aliens, despite what a lot of online content claims. They're about logistics. How did the Tiwanaku transport stones this heavy across this distance? What tools allowed them to achieve joints this precise using bronze, stone, and likely sand-based abrasives rather than iron or steel? And why, after investing this much labor and skill into a single ceremonial complex, did construction at Pumapunku apparently stop before it was finished, leaving some blocks in what looks like a partially completed state? Researchers have proposed abrasive stone-cutting techniques, wooden sledges, ramps, and large coordinated labor forces as plausible explanations, and progress continues. But a complete, evidence-backed picture of the construction process, start to finish, has not yet been assembled. Even objects that seem small and simple can resist explanation just as stubbornly as massive stone monuments. Scattered across the former territory of the Roman Empire, from Britain to Hungary, archaeologists have found more than 100 small 12-sided objects, made of bronze or occasionally stone, hollow in the center, with a small hole in the middle of each of the 12 faces, and small knobs at each corner. They date roughly between 100 and 300 AD, and they are called Roman dodecahedrons. Despite being discovered in dozens of locations, no ancient Roman text mentions them. No fresco depicts anyone using one. No workshop or manufacturing record explains their purpose. And so historians have proposed a long list of possible functions, everything from candlestick holders, which the objects are clearly not designed for given their structure, to religious or ritual objects, tied to astrology, given their 12 faces mirroring the zodiac, to surveying tools used for measuring distances or angles in land assessment, to knitting tools used for producing gloves or other tubular fabric. A theory that has gained some traction because the varying hole sizes on each dodecahedron would allow for different diameters of woven material. None of these theories has been proven conclusively, and the truth is that for an empire that documented so much of its daily life in writing, the near-total silence around an object found across so many of its territories is itself part of the mystery. Sometimes, what's missing from the historical record tells you just as much as what survives in it. Ancient civilizations didn't just leave behind mysterious objects. Sometimes they left behind entire vanishing acts. The Maya civilization, which flourished across Mesoamerica for centuries, famous for its precise calendar systems, advanced hieroglyphic writing and monumental step pyramids like the one at Chichen Itza, experienced a dramatic collapse between roughly 800 and 950 AD, when many of its great cities in the southern lowlands were abruptly abandoned and left to the jungle. For decades, the cause was debated without much hard evidence to settle it. But more recent research, including chemical analysis of stalagmites from caves in the Yucatan region, has provided a clearer picture. That mineral evidence shows that the classic Maya decline coincided with a series of severe droughts during the rainy seasons, including one drought that lasted an extraordinary 13 years. Combined with deforestation from intensive agriculture, soil degradation from overuse, and the resulting pressure on food and water resources, this appears to have triggered increased conflict between city-states and a slow unraveling of the political and social systems that held Maya civilization together. It is one of the clearer cases where modern science has actually closed much of the gap in an old mystery, showing how climate stress alone can be enough to bring down a sophisticated, highly organized society. But even here, scientists still debate exactly how these factors combined and in what order, and why some Maya cities in the northern Yucatan survived and even thrived for centuries after the southern lowland cities were abandoned. North America has its own version of this puzzle at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, which was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, home to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people at its peak around 1050 AD. Cahokia featured massive earthen pyramid mounds and a level of urban planning that surprises people who assume large pre-contact cities didn't exist in North America. And yet, by around 1350 AD, Cahokia was abandoned, its population dispersed, its mounds left standing empty. Environmental stress, resource depletion, and social upheaval are all part of the proposed explanation, but no single cause has been definitively proven, and the exact sequence of decline remains an active area of research. A similar, unresolved abandonment happened at the ancestral pueblo and cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado, where sophisticated, multi-story stone structures built into canyon walls were suddenly left behind around 1300 AD after centuries of continuous occupation, despite extensive archaeological investigation into climate, resources, and social conflict as possible triggers. In southern Africa, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe present a different kind of puzzle, not why it was abandoned, but how it was built at all using the methods it clearly used. Constructed around 1200 AD, its massive stone walls, some over 30 feet tall, were built entirely without mortar, using precisely shaped granite blocks fitted together so tightly that the structure has survived for centuries in a region with heavy seasonal rains. For a long time during the colonial era, European commentators refused to believe that African civilizations built it, inventing theories about foreign builders that have since been thoroughly discredited by archaeological evidence, confirming it was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. But even with that history corrected, questions remain about the exact engineering methods used to achieve this level of precision without mortar or advanced metal tools, and about the full extent of the trade networks that made Great Zimbabwe wealthy enough to support such an ambitious building project. And then there is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which may be the single most disruptive archaeological discovery of the last 50 years, precisely because of how much it undermines what we assumed we knew about the order in which human civilization developed. Built roughly 11,600 years ago, UNESCO describes it as one of the very first examples of monumental architecture built by humans anywhere on Earth. Massive carved limestone pillars, arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with detailed carvings of animals, were erected by hunter-gatherer communities thousands of years before agriculture, writing, or the wheel had been developed anywhere in the region. Traditional models of human history assumed that farming and settled village life had to come first, generating the surplus resources and organized labor needed to build large monuments. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite may be true in this case, that the desire to gather for ritual or religious purposes and to build something monumental together may have come before agriculture and may even have helped drive its development, as large gatherings of hunter-gatherers required food sources reliable enough to sustain them during construction and ceremony. Why hunter-gatherer societies with no permanent settlements invested this much coordinated labor into a site like this, why the site was later deliberately buried under tons of soil around 8000 BC, and what belief system motivated all of it, remain open questions that are reshaping the field of archaeology in real time. What ties all of these mysteries together isn't magic, and it isn't a hidden ancient technology waiting to be rediscovered by someone with the right theory online. It's something more grounded and, honestly, more interesting. Every one of these puzzles exists at the edge of what physical evidence can tell us. We can measure a gear's tooth spacing to the millimeter, but we cannot recover the name of the engineer who cut it. We can radiocarbon date a cave to within a few centuries, but we cannot recover the spoken instructions given to the workers who carved it. We can trace drought patterns in a stalagmite with extraordinary precision, but we cannot fully reconstruct the political decisions being made in a collapsing city in real time. Archaeology and historical science are, by nature, working with fragments, and fragments will always leave gaps that full certainty can't fill. New tools do keep closing some of these gaps. Ancient DNA analysis has completely rewritten our understanding of migration and family structures in prehistoric Europe. Satellite imaging solved the mystery of the Nazca spiral wells. Chemical analysis of cave formations solved much of the mystery around the Maya collapse. Advances like these are genuinely changing the field, year after year, discovery after discovery. But some puzzles, like the Antikythera mechanism's missing lineage, or the untranslated pages of Linear A in the Voynich manuscript, or the true purpose behind the Sajama lines and the Roman dodecahedrons, remain stubbornly out of reach, not because science has failed, but because the physical evidence needed to answer them may simply not have survived the thousands of years between their creation and our discovery of them. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that ancient people had some secret, forgotten power beyond human explanation, but that human ingenuity, organization, and ambition have always run far deeper than the surviving record can fully prove. The past is not empty. It's just quiet in places, and it is going to take a very long time and a lot more careful, patient science before we get it to speak in full.